your patience. I understand some of you are waiting for the pages to get in here. Here's to all of you. We're incredibly grateful to you all, and we're going to try to speak into the microphone so the people on the sides can hear. Is it working out okay so far? Yes. Okay. Let's hear it for the sides. Yes. Welcome. I know you've been here for a while, but welcome anyway to the New York Times Great Read in Bryant Park. My name is Gail Collins. I'm the editorial page editor of the New York Times, and I'm here today. Thank you. I'm here today with three of my colleagues, spectacular writers who also amazingly have books out that are available. Starting directly on my right, you all know Bob Herbert, our columnist. Bob's book is Promises Betrayed, Waking Up from the American Dream, by the way, available at your bookstore. Next to Bob is Paul Krugman. Paul is, of course, an op-ed columnist as well, and his most recent book is The Great Unraveling, Losing Our Way in the New Century. He's also about to publish, with his other hat, a book called Principles of Economics, which is not from his columns, which he's co-authored with his wife, Robin Wells. And on my far right is Verlin Klinkenborg. Verlin is a member of the editorial board of the Times. He also writes the much-loved Rural Life columns for us, and his most recent book is Rural Life. He has another one coming out very soon, which I guarantee is not taken from his work at the Times, called Timothy, or Notes of an Abject Reptile. It's told from the turtle's point of view, as I understand it. I'm going to start just asking everybody one or two questions, and then all of the guys have said that they would like very much to let you ask questions yourself, so we'll throw it out pretty early for questions. And I think if you just go to the microphone back there, you can ask them. But first, I'd like, Bob Herbert, I don't know if any of you know this, but Bob is the most senior columnist at the New York Times. Been doing it longer than anyone in history. And of course, before that, he was a columnist at the New York Daily News. So he's been writing columns for how many years now, would you say?
We don't want to go into that.
So my question is how you continue to do it. Get up in the morning and stay so fresh.
I have a mortgage.
Get close in.
There was a time, and I'm sure you remember this, when if you were doing 2 or 3 columns a week, you would wake up some mornings and wonder, what the heck am I going to write about? It's a slow news day. Sometimes we would have slow seasons. The summer was generally particularly slow. That's over. It has not been like that for many years now. And so now, if I need inspiration, all I have to do is wake up and think George W. Bush. That will... But the truth is, there are so many enormous stories that have legs, as we say in the business. I mean, if you go back to the disputed election of 2000, and then there were the events of September 11th, and then there was the Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, and then there was the presidential election of 2004. And then we have apocalyptic stories like the Hurricane Katrina and the flooding, the aftermath. And so it's sort of like just running in a mad dash from one breaking news story to another. So it's not that difficult to stay fresh in these times. These are peculiar times.
Thank you. Paul, I've always actually wanted to ask you this. By day you're a mild-mannered professor of economics at Princeton University, and then you go home and take off your jacket and you're the killer columnist Paul Krugman. How does that work for you?
It all started with Social Security. During the 2000 campaign, I was trying to write, economics, and then there was this campaign going on, and there was this guy named George W. Bush who had a proposal on Social Security. And the thing about it was that it was nonsense, that it didn't add up. So two things. One was, my God, I can't believe somebody is running for president saying that 2 minus 1 equals 4. And the second thing is, I can't believe that my colleagues in the media are letting him get away with it. So it was kind of it was a sort of a radicalizing experience that you said, because the whole storyline was, here's this bluff, honest guy, and I said, but he's lying all the time about his central campaign proposal, also about the tax cuts, and it's been kind of like that. I mean, in fact, if you were viewing the events of the last 5 years through the prism of actually knowing something about the numbers, then you were getting a very, very different picture until quite recently from the one that was sort of the official storyline of the nation. So that when we talk about those days, the few months after 9/11, when I still hear people talking about that wonderful glow of national unity that we had, and where did we lose it? And where I was sitting, it never happened. I got calls from people on Capitol Hill within 2 days of the attack saying, you won't believe this, that Bill Thomas is trying to use the terrorist attack to push through a cut in the capital gains tax. And then a few weeks later, we had the White House trying to push through a retroactive tax cut for corporations, again, using the terrorist attack. So just because I was following the economic stuff, it was apparent to me from very early on that the story we were being told was not what was actually going on. And things go on. There's a funny thing about where we are right now, which is that people who are considered to be leftists or crazy, if you actually look at what their views about policy are, and that very much includes me, they're actually what we used to consider quite moderate. I mean, still have the handwritten letter denouncing me from Ralph Nader for my pro-trade views. But it's the question of whether, if you are just saying, my God, we've got some dishonest, irresponsible people running things, then the tone becomes quite radical. And if we ever get out of this, I'll go into a phone booth and turn back into a mild-mannered college professor again.
Somehow I don't think that's going to happen very soon. Now I want to ask Verlin, I want you all to know Verlin actually lives on a farm and has a farm, little bitty working farm in Columbia County, and because of that, he has the best excuses of anybody I've ever worked with when he's late. We got one the other day when I came in and it said, Verlin will be late because a fox got into the chicken coop. I swear to you, this is true.
It's the story of the country.
I was going to say, that's Paul's excuse.
Now, Verlin both writes editorials, which, of course, don't have any names on them, and Rural Lives and other sign pieces for us. And I find that your tone is very different in the two of them, and I was wondering how you distinguish between writing editorials and writing sign pieces.
Well, I'm the answer to the SAT question, which person does not fit this panel, because these guys are all columnists who I think of as having the loneliest job in journalism. I assume that they just think these things out for themselves and work out their positions, write them out, and they appear. I have the luxury, actually, of serving with 13 or 14 other editorial board members who function as extensions of my brain to a certain extent. Our meetings are social, they're very intellectual, and they're often quite deliberative and mostly very funny, because everybody's engaged in the same pursuit, which is trying to get the best arguments on the table for the kinds of pieces we end up writing. And when you think about the pieces that run on the editorial page, there are issues that really matter most in the voice of the New York Times, however you choose to characterize that voice. I'll give you a good example. I wrote a piece that came out about 3 weeks ago called Destroying the National Parks. It was about the Parks Administration's effort to rewrite the management policies Now, I spend a lot of time in the national parks, a lot of time in the West. It would have been easy for me to have written that as a piece in the first person. But in terms of the actual weight the story carries, the weight that the point I'm trying to make carries with the administration, if it carries any point with them at all, but it does carry an enormous point with all of you, it makes a much better argument to have it in that neutral voice that I think, to the surprise of a lot of writers, it actually offers me a lot more freedom not to have my name on a piece. It gives me a license, in a sense, to be more emphatic, to feel more authoritative, to be less self-effacing than I might be in my own voice. Whenever I publish something on the bottom of the editorial page that's signed, there's always that feeling that you always have, I always have when I write a piece, which is, what if I'm getting it really wrong? Which I try to make sure never happens, obviously. I feel equally bad about it if it were signed or unsigned, but somehow when it's a signed piece, it feels like they might actually come to get me personally somehow, which is why I admire what these guys do, because everything they say is in their voice.
With the editorials, they just come and get me. They don't come and get Verlin.
That's right.
I always think you should have one story, if you're nice enough to come to something like this, that we've never actually told anybody before. And I was thinking, when Bob was talking, that I think I've never told this story, but Bob and I have worked at 2 papers together now. We were together at the Daily News, and the most uncomfortable I have ever seen him is when we had George Bush come in 2000 to a meeting of the editorial board and assorted other Timesians while he was campaigning for president, and Bob was there, and Bob wound up sitting next to George Bush. The publisher's on one side, Bob is on the other side, and George Bush is a guy who likes to bring people around with his personal charm. I think that's fair to say. So as he's talking, more and more you notice suddenly he's patting Bob. He's sort of
It's a true story.
and Bob is looking more and more uncomfortable, I can tell you. And by the end, he was only talking to Bob, you know. The publisher asked him a question, and he totally ignored him, and he was just going like this. And Bob is going, question there, and he finally said, oh, your boss wants to talk, huh, Bob? It was just totally all about Bob. It was very interesting, and I have never seen this guy as slightly uncomfortable as he was that day.
It was very, very weird. And it is true that the publisher, Arthur Sulzberger, is to his right, asking a question, and Bush said, just a minute, and he was going to continue. And I said, no, go ahead, answer the publisher's question. Please. God.
Tell us a little bit about Katrina. Bob was down in New Orleans for part of the hurricane's aftermath.
The thing about Katrina, what I try to do in a lot of the columns is show sort of the human impact of these big issues or policies or decisions made by great leaders and that sort of thing. So when I went down to Louisiana, the whole idea was to see what was happening to the evacuees, the people who had been run out of town and who did not have any money and didn't have a place to stay. And it was extremely moving, and it became not so much initially what their situation was when I was talking to them. The situation was simply that they had nothing. But they wanted to talk about the experience that they had gone through. And so there was one woman, I think she was 64 years old, who the flood had hit so quickly, she didn't have time to get out of her house. So she went from the first floor to the second floor, and the water kept coming up, and she went from the second floor to the attic. And she was in the attic, and the water kept coming up, and she's saying to me, and finally the water is up to here, and I thought that I was going to die. And in a state almost of panic, she began clawing at the underside of the roof of her house, and somehow, she's not even too clear how, she managed to claw her way out of the attic and was picked up by a boat, and that's how she was saved. And I think that in the news business, there are so many amazing human stories that we never have the time or the space to cover, and it's very frustrating because that woman's story was just one of very many. That was even just one of many that I heard. And so I think that if the media were going to try and change a little bit about the way it goes about its business, my first suggestion would be try to show in a clearer way how these big issues, how these policies that get argued about in kind of an abstract way have a real effect on real people.
Thank you. Guys can jump in anytime you like, of course. But Paul, I was going to ask, as the person who gets most of the mail, I think probably Paul is the most flashpoint person for a combination of people but most of the columnists have very, very large fan bases, but for both love-hate intensity, I would say probably Paul leads the pack. Can you have any thoughts about why that is?
By the way, I should tell you that this story about columnist celebrity. Earlier this past week, a woman came up to me in a restaurant and said, I love you, I love your columns, I love everything you write, and I think your latest book, The World is Flat, is the best so far. It's an interesting thing because it's not exactly as if Bob or Frank Rich or Maureen are exactly shrinking violets on these things. I think it's the fact that I have facts and numbers, which you might think that's just a rant. I hate George Bush would drive people crazy, but when I say George Bush is doing a bad job and here are the numbers, that's what really drives people crazy, or provides a kind of a lift to people who are feeling different. Of course, not just that. I think it's a funny thing. I think there's something about. I think in some ways it's a weakness of my writing that I'm not very good at the human interest side. So I tend to do these things that are very fact-packed, and that seems to rather oddly get people even more worked up emotionally than if I were just emoting in the column, and it's the problem. It's also there is this point that in some ways, for reasons that I'm not entirely clear about, I was picked up as public enemy number one in the sort of 6 months after 9/11, and it sort of stays. There's the anti and pro forces of me are actually institutionalized. There are people who do it sort of full time.
Berlin, I just have to do this for the curious people out there. You've got to explain about the turtle book just a little bit.
Oh, okay. Well, in the 18th century, there was a great English natural historian named Gilbert White, who wrote a book called The Natural History of Selborne, which was a very closely observed look at his own little parish in the south of England. Which birds lived where, when they came, why they migrated, what was going on all year round. And in his garden, he had a tortoise named Timothy that he had inherited from his aunt, whose name was Rebecca Snook, in 1780. And I was reading Gilbert White's journals about 4 winters ago. My specialty as an academic was the 18th century English literature. And I noticed that White was spending a lot of time carefully watching this tortoise, watching diet, watching hibernation, watching motion, all of these things. And I had a thought that I could not repress, which was, what would it be like to write a book in which the tortoise watches the natural historian? So I did. And this book is really, it sounds frivolous, and often it is, but it's actually a serious meditation about the character of human nature. By trying to imagine myself not in the character of human nature, by trying to imagine myself as a cold-blooded reptile. And in an odd way, it ties together very closely with what I do in the rural life pieces with our life, my wife's life with me on our farm, because that life itself looks like just a lifestyle choice, but it actually serves as a basis for comparison, a basis for, it allows me to think seriously about agricultural history in the United States, which I write a lot about the environment, about how we think about the nature around us, how we protect it. It's certainly possible to write about all those things from the center of the city, but I find it much easier to think about them, much easier to notice what I need to notice up in the country. And this book is really just an extension of that from a very different point of view.
I can't wait for this one. We're going to go to questions now. If you'd like to line up at the microphone, if you have one. While you get organized, I'm going to ask a really quick one. I know that both Paul's wife, Robin, is here, and I think Bob's in-laws are here, so I can ask this. Do you guys have groupies, like, columnist groupies?
Oh, they're lined up on 43rd Street outside.
Good answer. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Mel Berkowitz. I teach and I've done research in science. I have two questions. One first addressed to Dr. Krugman. Bush is sort of more like the front for the heads of the corporations and the oil companies, drug companies, Wall Street firms, and I don't see too much attacks on them. And I know they have a lot of power because they're the ones that contribute the money to the government. My second question...
I think we'll just do one question per person, otherwise we won't have enough. But go ahead, Paul.
I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification, by the way. I think it's a coalition that's running the country, and it includes corporate interests, it includes the religious right, it includes it's not as quite that straightforward. But look, I mean, you certainly will be seeing a lot from me about the drug companies in future columns. I'm doing a lot of work on that, so it's coming. And I think that's there's only so much you can do. How many people will recognize if you go after an individual corporate executive? You have to make arguments about how the system works, and of course, politics. We do not elect we do not elect CEOs, but we do have a chance to vote for politicians based on whose interests we think they serve.
Thank you very much. Next question. Go ahead.
My question is whether you have ever considered having a columnist focus on New York City politics to the same extent that you focus on national politics. The case in point being the Republican National Convention last August, in which 1,800 people were arrested illegally. The New York Civil Liberties Union issued a report documenting the abuses that took place, and the police commissioner the next day defended the police policy and said they did nothing wrong, although most of the arrests were thrown out and the New York County District Attorney declined to prosecute.
Okay.
But who
Okay,
holds city officials accountable? Shouldn't there be a column to hold city officials accountable?
Oh wait, Bob does. Go ahead. Yeah.
I would be the logical one on the op-ed page to focus more on New York City, especially. Worried about that feedback.
He's afraid of it.
I'd be the logical person, and I think that your point is well taken. And I used to do more pieces on city politics and that sort of thing. It's just that the events of the past few years have been almost apocalyptic, and you look a little weird if you ignore them. I think you're absolutely right about the protesters during the GOP National Convention, and I was talking to a woman before we started here, and told her that I thought that I should have written about that, and I was sorry that I hadn't, and that I may still take a crack at it. I think the media fell down on that story. I think it was an unbelievably important story. It was an outrage. The behavior of the mayor and the city police was in direct defiance of the Constitution, and we should have risen up almost in a frenzy and say that that sort of thing is not going to happen in the U.S., and it's certainly not going to happen in our city, New York City. That didn't happen, and I'm sorry that that didn't happen.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi. I'm really puzzled by the sort of moral paralysis that seems to have gripped the Times in the weeks and months leading up to the Iraq War. As all of us in this tent know, the Times was certainly not anti-war, did not do the kind of critical questioning on the reasons why we went to war. And now looking back at that time, do you as writers for the Times have any thoughts? I'm sure you've done some kind of a post-mortem. I was wondering what your thoughts are.
Well, you need to divide, as I'm sure most of you know, between the news side and the opinion side of the paper. We're totally separate. All of the guys here and myself are all on the opinion side. The news side operates completely separately. And speaking for the editorial page, we were against the war. The editorial board was against the war. We said it was a bad idea. But even having said that, after a year or so had passed, it became very clear to us that we had been too willing to be uncritical about the arguments about weapons of mass destruction, and that we should have been more critical and listened harder to people, particularly the people on our board who had a scientific background, who were much more dubious about it than the people on the board who had more of a political background. And we wrote an editorial saying that. I don't speak for the news side, but the news side also analyzed what they had done and wrote the longest editor's note in the history of the universe, sort of analyzing what they had done wrong and coming to grips with it. So it's not as if we...
There was a long mea culpa that was published a long time after the war had begun. But it seems to me that even to a lay person like me, it was transparent that... Okay, I was just saying that notwithstanding the long mea culpa that the Times published long after the war had started, I felt that even as a completely lay person without access to the inside facts of the weapons of mass destruction, it was pretty obvious to me that people were making up these stories, and everyone just bought it.
Thank you very much. Next, go ahead.
Hi, I wondered if you would address a little bit the difference between opinion journalism versus, say, outright politics, and engaging, and I'm thinking in particular of, say, Valerie Plame and the op-ed columnist in another New York newspaper, and how they tended to go straight to the administration's talking points, and diverting the attention over to the motivations behind Mr. Wilson and his columns and that sort of thing, and kind of defending that and not talking about the real question, whether or not was it ethical, was it illegal. Is there a line between where you come at it from a real angle, a professed angle, a liberal, conservative, if that means anything anymore, or pragmatic, but a professed angle and it's an opinion and everybody knows that, versus actual advocacy or serving as a mouthpiece? And is that line being crossed too often?
It's hard to say when you're talking about opinion journalism, about our side of the wall, whether all of the opinion columnists that we have are deeply, deeply, deeply independent human beings who follow their own drummers. There are certainly people out there who make much more of an effort to be really in line with whatever the administration is saying. I don't know, once you're doing opinion journalism, I mean, it's your vote as to who you like and who you don't like. Our standards are just that we try to be factually accurate and try to be very open about where we're coming from. And that, does anybody else have any thoughts about that, guys?
I was just going to say that if your fantasy is that that lots of journalists sympathetic to the administration get an email every morning telling them what they should say, yeah, that actually happens, but not, I believe, at the New York Times.
Well, I think it's actually more than that. I mean, I know in our discussions in the editorial board, the fact that we speak to so many different kinds of people about so many different kinds of issue. Everybody has a story they want to sell you, and they want to sell you the line on the story they want to sell you. And that produces, I think, in people with a certain amount of experience, an almost immediate allergic reaction. The harder the pressure to find the line that the people you're talking to want you to find, the more you're likely to resist it. It's partly just the nature of understanding where the truth is likely to lie.
And I think there is a distinction between just out-and-out politics or, on the other side, strongly held opinions. But at some point, the reader has to do a little bit of work, and the reader has to look at the column and decide, is this the strong and apparently genuinely held opinion of the writer, or do we think this person is simply a mouthpiece for one party or the other, or for some political figure? And I think that since there are columnists out there who are a little more than mouthpieces for left or right, I mean, it doesn't matter, Republicans or Democrats, I frankly think it's not that difficult to tell the difference. So you can have someone who is speaking on behalf of policy supported by George W. Bush, who can make a legitimately reasoned argument, I suppose. Or you could have the other side. And then you can have those writers who you know are just taking their marching orders, say, from the White House or from the Democratic National Committee. I think that if you're a regular reader of the news, I think it's not that difficult to be able to tell the difference.
Thank you. You know, in theory, we're at our ending point, but since we're the last group, we have like, extra powers. So I think, are you at the end of the line, sir? We're going to finish the questions of the people who are already in the line, but we won't do any more beyond that, okay? Go ahead, ma'am.
My name is Jayanti. I'm here from New Jersey. I admire the panelists today, and I'm here just to attend this discussion. I wanted the opinion of the panel. The new Supreme Court Chief Justice, do we have, in your opinion, do we have a neocon revolutionary, or is this someone different? And how should the Senate go about, with questioning? What would be your advice to the Senate about questioning the new replacement for the new vacant seat coming up in the Supreme Court?
Well, speaking for the editorial board, our final position on Judge Roberts was that we just didn't know enough about him to recommend that he be the next Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So the page, advocated voting no, but with the understanding that clearly that was not going to happen. But we're just a little tired and worried about having one person after another with no paper trail who has very little background, who's so really hard to track. But I suspect that the next person along will be perhaps a different story. It'll be interesting to see how that goes along. Guys, do you have any thoughts about that?
I have no idea what kind of Chief Justice Roberts is going to be for just those reasons. We don't know enough about him. But I think if there's any lesson to be learned from this appointment and the appointments yet to be made, it's the importance of voting in your presidential elections, because that is what determines who gets to make these appointments to the court. And I don't think that was taken seriously enough.
Bob, I have to tell you, looking out at this group, I see voters. These people are voters.
Well, they should tell their friends.
Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Krugman, your column this week, The Way It Is, was the most devastating indictment of the State of the Union I have ever read. My first reaction was, where do I go to resign my citizenship? My second reaction was, is there anything we can do between now and 2008 to straighten out our nation?
I guess the first thing to say is that we do have a we do have a Congress, and there is an election in 2006. So whatever your views, it's very, very wrong. And this is a mistake many people make, of course, to think that only presidential elections matter. The other thing is that it does matter what the public's view is. It's clear. Look, if there's one thing we've seen in the last 8 months, think about what everyone thought was going to be happening by now. They, in particular, up my original area, which was Social Security, it was widely considered that privatization was a done deal. And it's clearly not happening. And it's not happening because even though, yes, Bush won the election, yes, the Republicans increased their majority in Congress, nonetheless, the fact that the public clearly does not want this thing to happen actually makes a lot of difference. Beyond that, I think what is kind of disturbing and ought to be disturbing to people of whatever political persuasion is that we have this kind of revelation that aside from its ideological bent, the current government doesn't seem to actually be able to do anything right. And barring anything inconceivable, it will continue not being able to do anything right for almost 3.5 years, which is kind of alarming for the state of the nation. I just want to make one about writing op-eds. You should know that piece was a nightmare for my copy editor, because there were about 37 different facts that have to be verified. We do fact-checking on our op-eds.
I'd add one thing to what Paul is saying here, though, in terms of what we can do before 2008. I think one of the things that made Katrina a very soft point for the president was actually something that happened before it, which was Cindy Sheehan. It was the focus of a single person's testimony, a single person's direct witness against what was being asserted about that war in Iraq. I think it actually brought a kind of vulnerability that he had not had to experience before. And I think that capacity for individual testimony, for actual witness, is enormous for all of us.
And if I could add one word of caution about the gentleman turning in his citizenship, just keep in mind that in 1964, the Republican Party was supposedly dead, and 4 years later, Richard Nixon was elected president. In 1972, the Democrats were supposedly dead. 4 years later, Jimmy Carter was elected president. And you just never know. I think that the tide is turning politically in this country right now. I think there's no question about that. The real question is whether the Democratic Party, since it's only a two-party system, will be able to take advantage of it, and that remains to be seen.
Thank you. Next, go ahead.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm probably one of the few of my friends who actually reads newspapers on a regular basis, and I'm just wondering if the Times collectively wants to target young Americans. Because, 40 years ago, 45 years ago, students were upset, and we were organizing, and we were rallying, and there seems to be just a sense of apathy going on with our generation. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that? How do you feel about the state of young America today?
We certainly spend a lot of time thinking about them. I can guarantee you that. There are more meetings are had about how to get young people interested. We have a new product called Time Select, which is our new sort of web thing. And once we're a little bit farther into the year, Nick Kristof, one of our columnists, is going to do a contest for college students called Win a Trip with Nick. And I don't know if you read Nick, you will imagine where.
That's right. North Korea, here we come. That's right.
But yes, some lucky, very young college student will get to go with Nick to someplace in the third world, and then to do a blog for the Time Select about what's going on there. So yeah, we think about it a lot. Does anybody have any thoughts about youth? Go ahead.
I don't actually buy the argument about apathy, and the reason I don't is because part of my life is, like Paul, is as an academic. I spent the spring teaching at Pomona College in Southern California, and what I saw there, as I see also at Bard College all over the place, is incredibly experienced, incredibly dedicated, completely committed students who are looking most of all for a way to make a difference. I think the hard part for them at the age they are is knowing the most effective way to bring their enthusiasm to bear. But believe me, I looked at them and I thought of myself at the same age, and I had to convict myself of apathy, actually, because this group of people that I've been seeing, 18 to 21 years old, they're just not stopping for anything. And I think if they get the political direction they need, the kind of intellectual direction they need, anything is possible. Anything is possible.
I just thought I should mention that there was actually some quite impressive and also cute political activism just across the street from my office at the Frist Filibuster at Princeton, where we have the campus center is the Frist Center, built with profits from the corporation in which the Senate Majority Leader no longer owns any stock, During the debate over the filibuster, students organized what was supposed to be a 24-hour session, which ended up going several weeks continuously, with people speaking, reading from Aesop's fables, and so on. And it was a cute event, but it was showing that there was a lot of political activism. They had no trouble keeping the roster filled.
Thank you. Next, go ahead.
I have a soft voice, so I'm going to shout. Okay, my name is Shirley Camper-Soman. I'm a writer, and so my question really relates to you people as writers. In the first place, how do you avoid being depressed a lot of the time? And secondly, what do you do to relax?
Who said we avoided being depressed? I think one answer to your question is that the work itself, the actual task of making something that is worth publishing, making a collection of sentences, an essay, a column, something that has enough integrity and enough literary grace to really survive, is actually a wonderful antidote for depression in its own right.
I avoid being depressed by looking back at history. In the United States, we went through the Depression, we went through World War II. What we're going through now is not comparable to that, and we got through it all right. If you take a broader view of history, you have terrible calamities like the Holocaust and slavery and other events. And somehow this weirdo species of ours manages to get through. Now, I understand that there can be an awful lot of human suffering as you're managing to get through, but I just sort of keep in the back of my mind, other people have done it and maybe we will too.
I avoid getting depressed by going on bike trips in France and drinking a lot of good wine. Sorry.
We like Paul's way the best. Thank you very much. Thanks. Yes, sir.
The panel presents two people who make it very worthwhile. The panel presents two people who make it very worthwhile to get up at least twice during the week. The question I have is really a stretch that I want to direct to Professor Krugman. I don't know how often I've had to read your column, and I'm reminded of a poem by Robert Frost in which he talks about promises to keep. You have made, I stopped counting how many promises to go back to a subject that never seems to get returned. And I understand, of course, that Bush is president, but how or when will you go back to these articles and finish the discussions that you started?
I think I've only done that twice, but who's counting? But I try to. I mean, I really do try to do it. Sometimes there's just... let me say that Bob and I were talking about this before. You have stuff you're working on, themes that you're planning to come back to, but then events intrude. And boy, do events intrude these days. And it does have the effect sometimes that it may seem. I don't think I have ever actually completely dropped the subject, but it sometimes takes quite a while before I feel I can get to it.
You guys have been a fantastic audience. We really appreciate you so much. We hope to see you again next year. Thank you so much.